Hi class and welcome to lecture 2. The title of this lecture is Defining the State. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Now, the objectives of this lecture, we're going to be attempting, of course, to define and analyze the nation state. And I want to make clear before we get into that state and country are going to be used interchangeably. You might be used to hearing state in context to like the state of California or Wisconsin or Nevada or whatever it is. But for purposes of comparative politics and international relations, when we're talking about the global system, when I say state, I mean country. So I'll call France, United States, Britain, those are states. Pakistan, Afghanistan, those are states, okay? Even though they are countries. I'll use those interchangeably. Now, there are a lot of different definitions of the state. My personal favorite, and what I think is most interesting, is Max Weber's definition. Max Weber, of course, a very famous political scientist who has passed. He defines a state as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Now, if you've taken my American government class, you've heard this definition before, but I think it's worth revisiting because it's so interesting. Now, this is actually one of the questions you have on this week's discussion, number 2 right here. Max Weber wrote that power is the monopoly of legitimate use of violence. What does this mean? So I'm not going to get too much into it because I want you to explore it yourself. But what I really want you to focus on is the word monopoly. What does that mean? Essentially the only entity in control, right? So the government is the only entity able to use violence without repercussion, okay? What does that mean? What does that tell us about power? What does that tell us about who's in charge of the state? So take your best crack at that, and we'll discuss it more in the discussion post. Now, when we're talking about who controls the state, we have to mention the power sovereignty. Whoever is in charge of any state, again, country, is the power sovereign, okay? And that is the entity that has the ability to create, rescind, or alter the law of the land. And of course, again, going by Max Weber's definition, whose action carry legal force. The ability to make laws, implement taxes, go to war, trade with people, even imprison your own citizens, and in some cases, in some countries, like the United States, like China, execute citizens. That is the power sovereign, whoever is in charge. Sovereignty itself is the ability to carry out actions in your state, in your territory, without internal or external rivals and influence. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. If you are the power sovereign, if you're a sovereign nation, that means that you don't have another country dictating your domestic policy. They can't tell you what to do. And you don't have an opposing force trying to take over the government that's maybe controlling large portions of your territory. Okay, some states have that issue, right? If we look at states like Afghanistan, where again, a lot of issues are going on right now, the Afghani government didn't control large pieces of their territory. Same thing in Pakistan has that issue. So at some point, if enough of the population isn't following your government, do you really have sovereignty, right? That's something we have to ask ourselves. If you are the sovereign, you act independently, but you also have primary authority in that country. So to maintain and to get sovereignty, you of course need power. It's impossible to have a sovereign nation without power. How do you get and maintain power? You need to be armed. There is no nation in this world that maintains power without weapons. It's just how it is. And it's been like that simply forever, okay? And if you think about it, governmental laws and rules are really enforced with the words "or else" behind everything they say, right? Do not speed or else you'll get a ticket. Do not rob someone or else you'll go to jail. Do not murder or else you'll get life and maybe you'll be put to death. Okay, so every governmental order, not just in this country, but in every country, has the ability to be armed and the ability to enforce their own laws. And of course, a big part of sovereignty also is to be able to protect your nation from domestic insurgency or external threat. Now, I want to differentiate the terms state and regime. We've already defined the state. We've already determined you need to have a sovereign and what it takes to gain sovereignty and maintain sovereignty. let's differentiate state and regime, starting with regime. Now, a regime is simply the government that runs the state. So right now in the United States currently, we are operating under the Biden regime. Prior to 2020, we were, or prior to the last election, when Biden was elected, we were operating under the Trump regime, the Obama regime before that, the Bush regime before that, the Clinton regime before that, the Bush regime before that, the Reagan regime before that, right? The state itself is bigger than the regime. The state itself is the actual governing authority. Okay, regimes change, but in the United States, at least right now, the state power remains the same. Okay, so let's now go back in history and talk a little bit about state systems. Why do we have the state system? Why do we have these sovereign nations who live in the same world, maybe compete, sometimes go to war, et cetera? Where does the state system come from? Now, there are European origins, like many other things. And the first manifestation of the nation state system perhaps took place further back in history than you're aware of. And that's in ancient Greece around 500 to 100 BCE. And they're not states, nation states like we have today, but rather a collection of small, almost, I believe around 200 city states. And it's really interesting because they operate in this kind of their own little world. They have international diplomacy relations. We mentioned it last lecture, but they share common language, customs, and traditions. Yet they really were their own individual sovereign states. Okay, they went to war with each other, they allied with each other, they traded, etc. So a lot of political scientists will look at these nation states and try to draw conclusions. So here's a little YouTube video for some more information if you're interested on Greek city-states. There's a wealth of information on those, and they're very interesting. A lot of good writing on the Greek city-states. Not mandatory that you check this out, but if you're interested, I recommend that you click on this YouTube link. So again, like I said, the Greek city-state system wasn't as complex or as large as our nation-state system. Of course, the world is much bigger now. Technology is much different. So it's bigger in some ways, smaller in other ways. But they lack, certain aspects of our current nation-state system. But, again, it is worth, I think, looking at. So Greek city-states were eventually dissolved into the Roman Empire. But again, certainly worth discussing, certainly worth analyzing, like many political scientists do. So I think it's worth asking ourselves, whether it be Greek city-states, whether it be modern nation states, whether it be going back to feudalism or the period of colonialism or any other governmental system, we seem to, as human beings, want to organize ourselves in some sort of political system. We seem to want to group together and have some sort of government, whether it be a clan, a tribe, or large empires like the Roman Empire or the Persian Empire or the modern day United States, Russia, Japan, whatever it is. We seem to want to organize ourselves into these systems and have this government. So I think it's worth asking ourselves why. What is it about human nature that makes us want to band together? Is it simply protection? Is it because we're social creatures? I think there's a lot of potential answers here. So something to think about as we go forward. So going forward in history, and what we're doing here is we're kind of building up to our modern nation state system. We started with the Greek city-states and we're going through the medieval era now. So let's talk about the 5th to 15th century, known as the Dark Ages, the medieval era. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, one of the largest empires the world has seen, especially how they grew that empire so big with the technology that they had, is simply amazing. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe split into two, and we're not going to go into too much detail here because I don't want to get lost in the history. I want to talk more about the state system itself. So you have the medieval Catholic Empire in the west, you have the Byzantine Empire in the east, with the capital of Constantinople, which is now, of course, Istanbul, as I'm sure you know. Here's a really crude map that shows the area we're talking about. Okay, you can see Greece over here, you can see Istanbul and of course, Turkey. So how we would categorize the medieval era would be, just as it's spelled out, the Dark Ages, there's very few clearly defined territories. Not like today where we have borders and we know where our borders are defined with few disputes. In the medieval area, it was very undefined borders. There was a lot of violence, there's a lot of conflict, there was a lot of disorder. That's why it's called the medieval Dark Ages, right? So towards the end of the medieval era, you get kings start to become more powerful. They begin to defy the church. The church was very powerful, but the kings begin to kind of rebel against the church. They begin to subordinate their lowers, their barons, and they start creating these nations with more definitive borders, right? Because they want to consolidate their power. They want they want more land, but they also want to take what is theirs. So of course, anytime you're going to start drawing borders and cutting up Europe, you're going to get conflict. So we start getting rivalries and bigger wars as kings sought to expand their powers. So after the close of the medieval era, as this begins to happen, we get the emergence of the modern day nation state, which is more important and relevant to what we're talking about. This is what we're going to be talking about the rest of the semester. And this is important. We can associate the creation of the modern day nation state system to really two events, primarily the second. That is the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia. So let's talk about that a little bit. 30 Years' War, I'm guessing you can guess why they called it the 30 Years' War. Basically started as a religious war, but grew to a war among European powers, kind of European continental war. Between sovereign states, the first of its kind. Eventually, to end the 30 Years' War, they meet in 1648 and establish what is known as the Peace of Westphalia. And the Peace of Westphalia is really what creates the modern day nation state system, okay? And that happened again in 1648. What they established in the Peace of Westphalia was definitive borders, okay? Respect for sovereign nations with definitive borders. I mean, think about it like this, guys. Can you imagine a war that went on for 30 years? That is insane, right? When we talk about the Civil War, we're talking about 5 years. The United States was in World War II for 4 years? Imagine that going on for 30 years. It's really crazy. So they knew it had to end. They get together and they negotiate and they create the modern day nation state system because they want to define borders. They want to create their own sovereign nations. And out of that emerges the nation state system that we still have today. Other things that the Peace of Westphalia, again, in 1648 created was the notion of balance of power. The idea that if one state becomes too big, perhaps others will band together to counteract that growing state. And you see that throughout Europe, throughout history, right? You see that with Napoleon, you see that with Hitler, et cetera. It creates a multipolar Europe, a Europe of acknowledged great powers. And we've seen this challenge throughout time, but it's stood the test of time, I would say. So again, the Peace of Westphalia, its importance cannot be overstated. It created the system of respect for sovereign borders that still exists today. Now, I say that there, of course, have also been challenges to it, all right? And maybe there'll be challenges in the future, but we've had a relatively peaceful period of time since World War II, so hopefully that balance isn't disrupted again. So here's a little funny video on the Peace of Westphalia. It kind of pokes fun at how they're dividing nations up. Not mandatory that you watch this, but if you want to if you like British humor, you might enjoy this. So that's going to do it for lecture 2, part A. I will be creating part B and maybe part C. So please tune in for that as well.